In 1953, a shy Mississippi teenager walked into class with a guitar. His teacher scolded him, warning that music would never take him anywhere. But seconds later, he did something that froze the entire school in silence and changed how they saw him forever. The year was 1953. Inside Humes High School in Memphis, the air smelled of chalk dust and worn floorboards. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching the dust in golden beams. The sound of pages turning filled the room as 30 students settled into their desks. In the back row sat Elvis Presley, 18 years old, with a battered guitar resting against his knee. The wood was scratched, its strings a little worn, but to him it was more than an instrument. It was the one thing that made him feel less invisible. The teacher's voice echoed as she called the roll. "Presley." Elvis raised his hand, eyes lowered. Most students barely noticed him. To them he was quiet, awkward, maybe even strange. But on that day, something about the way his fingers brushed the strings felt different, like he knew a storm was waiting to break. Around him, classmates whispered and giggled. Dorothy Mae Jones, a girl 2 rows up, scribbled in her notebook. Later, she would write about this very moment in her diary. She would remember how Elvis kept glancing down at the guitar, as if it was begging him to speak through it. The teacher, Miss Scrivener, frowned when she noticed the guitar. "Not in here, Presley," she said sharply. The class hushed for a second, then broke into low laughter. Elvis's face flushed. He shifted in his seat, caught between shame and defiance. The room itself seemed to press against him. The desks, the walls, even the muffled sound of footsteps in the hall. He knew what people thought of him. Too poor, too shy, too strange with his slicked hair and southern drawl. But inside, a fire burned. He could almost hear his mother's voice, urging him not to hide. She had told him once, "Don't be afraid to let them see who you are." He carried those words like a secret shield. Every breath felt heavy. He tightened his grip on the guitar neck, fingers twitching as if the music wanted to escape. The students kept watching, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting to laugh again. The bell hadn't rung yet. The lesson hadn't even begun. But already the story was writing itself. Elvis could either bow his head and put the guitar away, or he could let the room hear something it had never heard before. What would you have done if you were him? Would you hide to avoid ridicule, or would you risk everything for a single note of truth? The moment stretched longer, like the pause before a storm. None of the students knew it, but in that ordinary classroom, something extraordinary was about to unfold, and once it happened, none of them would ever forget it. The classroom felt tighter than ever. Chalk squeaked against the blackboard as Miss Scrivener wrote the day's lesson. Every letter echoed like a gavel. Elvis shifted in his seat, wishing the guitar would vanish, but it was too late. All eyes had already landed on him. Miss Scrivener turned, her brow furrowed. "Elvis Presley," she said, her voice sharp as a snapped ruler. "This is no place for noise. Put that guitar away." The words cut deep. They weren't just about discipline. To Elvis, they sounded like a sentence. "You will never belong here. Your music doesn't matter." The students erupted into snickers. A boy in the front row whispered, "Hillbilly." Another girl muttered, "Why does he always drag that thing around?" The laughter spread, filling the room like smoke. Elvis lowered his head. His cheeks burned. He had always been the odd one out, the boy from a poor family, the one who dressed different, the one who hummed songs instead of playing sports. He had felt this sting before, but somehow, today, it pierced deeper. His hand brushed the guitar, and for a moment he thought of surrender. He could slide it under the desk, avoid the punishment, pretend nothing happened. That would be safer. That would silence the whispers. But then another memory rose, sharp and unshakable. His mother's face, tired but loving, sitting in their small Tupelo home years earlier. She had told him, "Elvis, when the Lord gives you a gift, you don't hide it. You let it shine." Those words echoed louder than the laughter. Elvis stared at the floorboards, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down. The sound of the clock ticked at the back of the room, each second daring him to act. His knuckles tightened around the guitar's neck. What if he obeyed? He would disappear again into the background, a shadow in the corner, mocked until graduation. What if he didn't? He could be punished, humiliated, maybe even suspended. But maybe, just maybe, he could finally be heard. The class leaned in, waiting for him to fold. They expected him to blush, mutter, sorry, and pack the guitar away. That was the role he had always played, the quiet boy who didn't fight back. Instead, something changed. His shoulders straightened, his jaw tightened. He didn't look up at Miss Scrivener yet, but inside a decision was forming. He would not bow this time. Dorothy Mae Jones would later remember the silence that followed. It felt like the whole room was daring him to move, she wrote in her diary. I had no idea what he would do, but I knew it mattered. Miss Scrivener's eyes narrowed. Elvis, she repeated, slower this time. Put it away, now. The tension was unbearable. Students held back nervous laughs. A few waited for the explosion. And still, Elvis did nothing, just rested his fingers on the strings. The sound of one faint strum escaped. It was soft, accidental maybe, but enough to change the air. A single note, sharp and trembling, cut through the whispers. The class froze. Miss Scrivener's expression hardened, but she didn't stop him. Maybe even she felt the weight of that note, hanging in the air longer than it should. It wasn't a performance yet. It was defiance, pure and simple. One fragile string dared to speak where words could not. Would you have taken the risk? Would you have played, knowing ridicule could crush you? Or would you have stayed silent, safe but unseen? The laughter had stopped. The giggles had dried. And for the first time all year, the entire classroom waited to hear what Elvis Presley would do next. The single note lingered like smoke in the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, but it carried weight. For a moment, even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Then the whispers started again. Play it, Presley, a boy muttered from the corner. Another voice chimed in, mocking, Let's hear the hillbilly sing. The taunts grew, half amusement, half cruelty. Elvis sat frozen, guitar balanced on his knee. His chest rose and fell, each breath harder than the last. He could feel 30 pairs of eyes boring into him, waiting for the next move. He thought of all the times he'd been pushed aside, how kids laughed at his clothes from the thrift store, how they mocked the way he styled his hair. Every insult pressed down on him now, urging him to stay silent, to prove them right. But another voice battled inside him. It reminded him of nights spent in the tiny Presley home, when his mother would hum gospel songs by candlelight. Music had always been the only place he felt whole, the only place he wasn't an outcast. If he gave up now, he knew he would never forgive himself. Miss Scrivener folded her arms, staring him down. The authority in her silence was louder than any command. It said, Do as I say. Don't embarrass yourself further. The stakes tightened with every second. If he obeyed, he would be safe but invisible. If he played, he risked punishment, humiliation, and the final stamp of being the strange boy who couldn't fit in. But what if, just what if, the music could break through? Elvis's fingers hovered over the strings, trembling but determined. He strummed another note, stronger this time, clearer. The sound rippled through the room, sharp enough to cut the laughter in half. A hush followed. It wasn't respect yet, it was disbelief. Dorothy Mae Jones leaned forward in her chair. Years later, she would tell a reporter, It felt like watching someone walk a tightrope. I didn't know if he would fall or fly. Another burst of laughter tried to fill the space. Sing for us, Elvis, a student jeered, but the voice cracked uneasy, because something about that sound didn't feel like a joke anymore. Elvis lifted his head slowly. His eyes were still shy, but inside them was a flicker, like a candle refusing to die out. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't begging for approval. He was deciding. The weight of the room shifted. The students were no longer mocking. They were waiting to see if he would dare. The moment stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. What if his voice cracked? What if they laughed harder than ever? What if Miss Scrivener marched him straight to the principal's office? But another thought followed close behind. What if this is my only chance to show them? He tightened his grip. His foot tapped once against the wooden floor. He leaned into the guitar. Every sound in the room fell away. The shuffling of notebooks, the tapping of pencils, the distant footsteps in the hall. There was only him, the strings, and the silence waiting to be broken. One song could save him. One song could destroy him. Which would it be? The classroom was no longer just a classroom. It was a stage, a jury, a test of courage that could brand him forever. And Elvis Presley, mocked, scolded, cornered, was about to decide if he had the courage to play. The silence was unbearable. 30 students stared at him, waiting for the next move. Even Miss Scrivener didn't speak. The authority in her eyes was still there, but now there was something else too. Curiosity. Elvis's fingers rested on the guitar. He felt his pulse in his hands, a rhythm faster than any drum. He thought of his mother, of nights when she whispered lullabies while he strummed softly in their small living room. That memory steadied him. And then he played. The first chord rang out, strong and trembling at once. The sound filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. He leaned into it, strumming with more force, his voice rising to match. He didn't choose a flashy song. He chose an old ballad, one his mother loved. His voice carried a raw ache, the kind that comes from living through hardship. The words weren't just lyrics, they were pieces of himself. The laughter died instantly. A hush swept over the room, thick and heavy. No one shifted, no one coughed. The sound of his voice pulled everything else away. He sounded older than he was, Dorothy Mae Jones would later recall, like he carried something none of us could understand yet. Each note dug deeper into the silence. His voice cracked once, but it didn't matter. In fact, it mattered more. It made him real, human, vulnerable. The crack turned to strength, and the strength turned to fire. Miss Scrivener stood by her desk, frozen. The same teacher who had ordered him to put the guitar away now said nothing. Her sternness had melted into shock, maybe even awe. Elvis didn't look at anyone. His eyes closed, his whole body leaning into the sound. He wasn't singing for them. He was singing through them. Like the music had been waiting for an audience, no matter who it was. The class, once cruel and mocking, was transformed into a congregation. They weren't just listening, they were holding their breath. And then it happened. A single moment that no one forgot. Elvis hit a long, aching note, letting it hang in the air. It vibrated against the walls, through the desks, into the bones of every student in the room. No one laughed. No one sneered. For the first time in his school life, they weren't looking at a poor boy from Tupelo. They weren't seeing a shy teenager with strange clothes. They were seeing something else. Something they couldn't quite name yet, but couldn't look away from either. The boy they had mocked had become something more. The last chord rang, soft but final. He opened his eyes. The room remained still. What do you do when one act of courage flips an entire world upside down? Have you ever seen a single moment silence a crowd like that? For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Even the dust in the sunlight seemed frozen. And then the change began. The final chord still hovered in the air. Elvis lowered his hands, but no one moved. The silence was heavy, almost sacred. For a few seconds, it seemed the entire classroom forgot to breathe. Then something remarkable happened. A single pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant at first. Dorothy Mae Jones, her eyes shining as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. The sound echoed in the stillness, and soon another set of hands joined, then another. The applause grew louder, rolling through the room like a wave. Elvis stared down at his guitar, stunned. He hadn't expected it. He had braced for punishment, for laughter, maybe even detention. But not this. Even Miss Scrivener didn't stop them. She stood at her desk, lips parted, eyes fixed on him. Her authority was intact, but she no longer looked at him as a troublemaker. She looked at him as if she were seeing him for the very first time. For years, Elvis had been invisible. In that instant, he was undeniable. The same classmates who mocked his thrift store clothes now leaned forward with admiration. Some had tears in their eyes, though they'd never admit it later. Others stared in silence, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. The crowd that had been cruel was now transformed. They weren't a mob of teenagers anymore. They were an audience. Elvis swallowed hard. His heart still pounded. His fingers still shook. But inside, something shifted. He realized he had power. His voice, his music, it could stop laughter. It could silence cruelty. It could turn scorn into awe. He didn't smile. He didn't bask in the applause. He simply clutched the guitar closer, humbled, almost afraid of what he had unlocked. Dorothy Mae Jones would later write in her diary, "The whole class knew it." That was the moment Elvis changed. Not just for us, but for himself. The applause finally softened. The room returned to its fragile quiet, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. Before, it was filled with mockery, waiting for him to stumble. Now it was filled with respect. Even Miss Scrivener, who had demanded he put the guitar away, finally spoke. Her voice was softer than before, almost reverent. "Elvis, perhaps you'd better hold on to that guitar." It was not an apology, but it was close. Elvis nodded, still too overwhelmed to answer. Inside, though, he knew something beyond words. He would never forget this day. This was the first time his voice had turned strangers into believers. What if the very thing you're punished for is the one thing meant to set you free? How many of us hide our gifts, fearing judgment, when they might be the very key to our destiny? The bell rang, jolting the class back into reality. Desks scraped, books shut, footsteps echoed. But no one spoke to him the same way again. The laughter didn't return. The jeers were gone. The moment had redrawn the lines forever. As the students filed out, Dorothy lingered, glancing back at him. She would never forget the boy who risked everything for a song and changed the entire room with it. And Elvis Presley, still clutching that battered guitar, walked out knowing that for the first time in his life, the world had truly listened. By the time the story left the classroom, it had already grown into something larger. Whispers filled the hallways. "Did you hear what Presley did?" Students repeated the tale like folklore, each adding details, each painting the moment bigger than it had been. Some swore the teacher had been moved to tears. Others claimed Elvis's voice had shaken the windows. None of that was true, but it didn't matter. The truth was enough. One song had silenced ridicule and turned scorn into awe. Within days, kids who had never spoken to him before stopped him in the hallway. Some asked him to play at lunch. Others just nodded respectfully, as if they'd seen something they couldn't unsee. For Elvis, it was more than schoolyard chatter. It was proof that his music could reach people, even those who doubted him. He carried that memory like armor, a reminder that courage could rewrite the story. Dorothy Mae Jones would later recall in an interview decades afterward, "We didn't know we were witnessing history, but we all remembered that day. It was the day Elvis became Elvis." Years later in Memphis, a small plaque was placed inside Hume's High School. It read simply, "Elvis Presley attended classes here." His music began in these halls. Students and tourists still stopped to take pictures. Some even whisper the story of the day he defied a scolding and stunned the room. Artifacts surfaced over time. A torn yearbook page, signed Elvis Presley, 1953, carried doodles of guitars in the margin. A diary entry from Dorothy described the moment the room froze as his voice filled the air. Even a bootleg tape, mislabeled and scratchy, claimed to capture him singing that very song in a later practice session, though no one could prove it. By then, the story had already become legend. Fans retold it, embellishing, reshaping, but always circling back to the same truth. The shy boy who risked ridicule for a song, and that small classroom moment echoed into something greater. From high school corridors to sold-out arenas of 20,000, the courage he found in that instant carried him forward. Every ovation, every hush that fell over a crowd, was born from that seed. How many legends begin not in stadiums or on television, but in places no one ever expects. How many sparks are struck in the quiet corners of ordinary life? The schoolroom applause of 1953 may have seemed small, but it was the first ripple in a wave that would eventually crash across the world. And in that ripple, Elvis discovered not just who he was, but who he could become. That day in 1953 could have ended as nothing more than a scolding, a teacher's sharp words, a boy's silent shame, and a dream folded away in the corner of a desk. But Elvis Presley refused to hide. He chose instead to let one song speak for him. It was a simple act, just a teenager strumming in a classroom, but it carried a weight far beyond those four walls. That moment taught him something vital. Music wasn't just sound. It was power. It could silence cruelty. It could command respect. It could transform how people saw him and how he saw himself. Years later, as crowds of 20,000 held their breath in arenas across the world, the memory of that classroom lingered. The courage he found that day became the foundation of everything that followed. Miss Scrivener's scolding didn't stop him. It pushed him. The same words meant to silence him became the spark that set him free. And the classmates who once mocked him told the story for decades, proud to have witnessed the birth of something greater. It's a reminder that sometimes the voices trying to hold us back are the very ones that push us forward. Sometimes rejection is the doorway to destiny. What would you risk to live your truth? Would you take the leap, even if it meant facing laughter, punishment, or failure? For Elvis Presley, the choice was simple. He played, he sang. And in doing so, he turned a scolding into the first step of a legend. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder to never hide their gift. Were you ever told to stay quiet when your heart said to speak? Tell us below, we'd love to hear your story. And if you want more untold Elvis moments, watch the next video here.